Thank you for tuning in to episode 4 of Restoring a Dining Room Set. If you missed the first 3 episodes, click the link in the top right-hand corner for a playlist for episodes 1 through 3. In episode 3, we went through the process of removing the finish from the tabletop and prepping it for its final finish. We also did a little bit of a highlight of applying a gel stain to the chair. In this episode, we're going through a lot more detail of how do you prep the chair for that gel stain and apply that final finish. After we've stripped the chair, we've sanded it down with 120, 150 grit sandpaper, wiped it down with lacquer thinner to remove any of the dust, and then apply 2 coats of a 2-pound cut of de-wax shellac. The purpose behind the shellac is to mute back that red dye that remains in the chair, and so that it doesn't bleed through on the final gel coat stain. Once the shellac has dried, and shellac dries very quickly because it's alcohol-based, we then give it a light sanding with a 320-400 Scotch-Brite pad. Once that's done, we'll wipe down any of the dust off of it and get it ready for the gel coat stain. This chair is going to get a gel stain on both the seat and the crest rail. The spindles and the legs will be painted. Now on to the finish. We're applying a shellac-based primer to the legs as well as the spindles, applying 2 coats. Again, with the intention of muting back that red before we apply the final finish coat. We're now beginning the process of applying the gel stain. We apply the gel stain with an oil-based brush and apply it very liberally across the entire seat of the chair. As we go through, we ensure that we're getting good coverage across the entire chair and maintaining a flow of going with the grain of the seat itself. As we apply this gel stain, again, you want to apply it very liberally to make sure you get good coverage across the entire chair. We'll apply this gel stain to both the seat as well as to the crest rail. And as a caution, one of the things you may notice is that I applied masking tape to the base of the spindles to avoid getting stain onto the recently primed spindles themselves. So once we get the entire seat of the chair covered with the gel stain, we'll then move on and we'll start to do what's called a dry brush across the seat of the chair. Once it's completely stained, we then take a new brush that's dry and wipe off any of the excess stain that is on the chair. One of the things you may notice is that as I wipe the stain off, I'm then drying the brush on a paper towel. And the purpose behind that is to make sure that any excess that I've taken off does not get reapplied to the chair itself. Again, following the grain pattern of the chair, we're actually mimicking a grain in the chair with that darker stain. Because we're also trying to mute back that red blotchiness in the chair, it may be necessary for us to apply a second coat to this chair. You want to follow the exact same process when you do that, where you coat the entire chair, and then do the dry brush process to remove off any excess that is there. You normally do not need to sand after applying a gel stain. If you do feel some bumps in there, you probably want to use a 400 grit Scotch-Brite pad just very lightly to remove any of the bumps that may be left from the stain itself. While we wait for that gel stain to dry, we can turn our attention back to the tabletop. In episode 3, we went through and removed the finish from the top using stripper and a card scraper to scrape off all the old lacquer finish that was on there. Gave it a final sanding with a 150 grit sandpaper, and then wiped it down with lacquer thinner to remove any dust that may have been left from the sanding. Just like the chair, we then are going to apply 2 coats of a 2-pound cut of shellac. One of the things you'll notice when I'm applying the shellac is I'm starting in the middle, tipping off when I get to the edges so it doesn't drip over, and using a nice wide brush to limit any overlaps that we might have. We did the same thing to the underneath the table, adding the shellac, and then we apply the gel stain there as well. Just like the chair, we apply it liberally, and then go back with a dry brush and remove the excess and create the graining pattern on the underneath of the table. After waiting 24 to 48 hours for the gel stain to dry, we then laid down some blue masking tape to protect the stain finish and begin to apply the finish coat to the aprons of the table. Initially, we applied 2 coats of that shellac-based primer, and now we're applying a high-gloss enamel paint that will be the same paint used for the spindles and the legs of the chair to the aprons of the table. Again, this will get 2 coats, and then once complete, we'll flip it over and then start to work on the tabletop finish. While we wait for that tabletop to dry, we're going to turn our attention now to regluing a chair. This is probably one of the most stressful parts of furniture restoration. Sure, it's stressful when you take something apart, hopefully you don't break anything, but putting it all back together again after you've done repair work and some staining and some sanding, that hopefully all the pieces go back together the way you want them to. What I will always do is a dry fit first, make sure that all the pieces are there, arrange them so that when it comes time to do the glue, they're right at my fingertips, and I have all the materials I need, glue, clamps, and rags, ready to go. For this glue up, I'm using hide glue. And hide glue is the typical glue you'll see furniture restorers use for a couple of reasons. One, because you have a longer set time, and especially where we have multiple spindles across the back of this chair that need to be glued, we need that little bit extra time in order to get it on the glue onto the spindles and then actually work to get them in place. The second reason is when you're restoring furniture, you want to think about the next generation of restorers. Hide glue can be easily reversed, which is beneficial for a couple of reasons. One, because if you make a mistake when you glue up, or when it needs to be repaired sometime in the distant future, you can either use water or heat to soften the hide glue, to take the joint apart, do any repair work that needs to happen, and then glue it all back together again. What you see me doing in this video is aligning probably the first 4 or 5 spindles into the crest rail, and then using a clamp to gently hold it in place. It's not the final clamping pressure yet, just enough to hold that crest rail there while I align and get all the other pieces in. Sometimes you have to bend the spindles a little bit, maybe use a rubber mallet to get them into alignment, but then once you get them all set together, you can then apply your final clamp pressure. You'll notice I have a rag with a jar of water, and I use that to wipe my hands to make sure I'm not getting glue all over the chair, but then also to wipe off any glue drips as they happen. Cleaning up glue after the fact is a difficult thing. It's hard, especially where I have stain and primer on the chair. I don't want to damage what I've already done. So by taking the action right away, I save myself steps in the future. So again, get the alignments in. That hide glue gives me that extra time that I need in order to get things set. And then once it's ready, I can then turn my attention to assembling the arms. I apply the glue to both the spindle as well as to the arm of the chair, so I get good glue contact. Align it, twist them so they're in place, and then tap them with a rubber mallet to get there. One of the things you'll notice is that on chairs, when they have an arm, those spindles towards the front are angled. And what you'll need to do sometimes, and again, this is where the hide glue comes to your benefit, is it hasn't set yet. Even though you have it in the hole, you can still twist it to get it to align so you can properly get that arm back on the chair. This chair also has a mechanical fastener. So you have the arm and the spindles coming together, but then that arm fits into that longer stretcher rail on the edge with a screw. So once I get myself positioned, I'll then put the screws back in, put clamps on the crest rails and on both arms, and then be ready for the next step of the process, which is going to be the final finish. We now turn our attention to the final finish on the spindles and the legs of the chair, prior to which we applied 2 coats of a shellac-based primer, allowed that to dry, and then sanded it with a 220 grit Scotch-Brite pad to remove any roughness or drips from the primer coat. We then went through and masked off the areas of the arms and the seat to avoid any paint splatters on the finish. And now we're going to apply 2 coats of a high-gloss enamel paint. This is actually a self-leveling paint, so as you apply the paint, avoiding any drip marks, you will have brush marks as you're painting, but as it dries, those brush marks will disappear and leave you with a very high-gloss, smooth finish. There are 7 chairs in this dining room set, and as you can see, the majority of them are complete. There's one more chair that needs to have the crest rail and arms receive a coat of gel stain. In episode 5, which will be our final episode, We will apply the polyurethane finish to the chairs, as well as the gel stain and polyurethane finish to the tabletop itself. I appreciate you following along in this series. Please like and subscribe and receive notifications for the final episode in the series of Restoring a Dining Room Set.